All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Eno Center for Transportation webinar. My name is Paul Lewis. I am the policy director here at Eno, and today we're talking about governance and how governance of transportation systems works or doesn't work in our cities. And we're going to spend the next hour talking about that issue. We're going to talk about what works. We're going to talk about what doesn't work. We're going to talk about what it might mean to reform governance. And when we talk about this, we're talking about the different public and private actors that help make transportation function in our regions. That can be looking at who manages the transit network, who oversees the freight network, who makes decisions for our roadways, or who is building some of this infrastructure, right? And in some cases that's unified, and in other cases there's lots of different parties and actors in it. And so it's important when we're talking about creating new strategies to tackle today's problems to understand how those governance issues work. And it's one of those things that comes up a lot here at Eno. And to help this conversation, we have a very distinguished panel today. And they're going to help us talk through how governance works in their regions and how they've experienced it throughout their careers. We have MJ Maynard, who's the Chief Executive Officer at RTC Southern Nevada. We have Leslie Richards, who is the General Manager and Chief Executive Officer at SEPTA, the transit agency in Philadelphia. And we have Kevin Quinn, who is the Chief Executive Officer at TransLink in Vancouver, Canada. And so really happy to have the three of you on today. And excited to dive into this discussion. Before I start, there's just a couple quick housekeeping things. For those of you on the live stream, if you're having any issues, we found that just refreshing your browser tends to resolve a lot of those. And if you continue to have technological issues, there's a help button in the bottom left of your screen. You can go ahead and click that, and that should we can have some of our staff assist you. And then during this discussion, I certainly have a bunch of questions that I'm going to be directing to the panelists. And I also want to make sure that some of your questions are answered. There is a questions chat function. So if you see at the bottom right, there's a questions function. If you click on that, you can send a question and I can take a look at those. And I will be answering questions in the latter half of today's discussion. So please keep those coming. So I'm going to get started with the discussion right now, turning it over to the panel. And one of the things we wanted to start with is a little bit on the positive side. And this is an opportunity for each of them to describe a little bit about their organization and their organization's role in the broader transportation network in each respective region, and talking about what does your region get right? What's going well? What have been some of your governance successes? And then we'll talk about some of the challenges here in a little bit. But let's start with that. And I'm going to start with you, MJ, to talk a little bit about how things work in the Las Vegas region.
Thanks, Paul. And I want to mention that I'm excited to be on this panel with Kevin and Leslie, who I have a lot of admiration for, great colleagues. You know, I think there's an assumption that if you've seen one local government organization, you've seen them all, right? That every city and public organization, that we're bound by the same laws and regulations. And of course, you know, that's not the case. Las Vegas continues to be the entertainment capital of the world. We've recently added the word sports to our moniker as we've welcomed a professional football team, Go Raiders, a professional hockey team, a women's basketball team. We're home to 2.4 million residents and over 40 million tourists visit our city every year. So with that being said, in my view, Las Vegas still has sort of this wild, wild west mentality. You know, I'd like to say that our founding fathers back in the day sat in a room and they were very deliberative and very strategic, and they thought, oh, God, how do we create a statute around the creation of the RTC of Southern Nevada? I know, let's go regional. And you know, I don't think it happened that way. I think they probably maybe stumbled upon it. Inadvertently, they decided to go big. They decided to create a structure that is regional. And I'll explain that. Let me tell you a little bit about the RTC, our structure. So we wear a lot of hats. We're not only the public transit provider, we are also the metropolitan planning organization. We are the regional roadway funding agency. We are the traffic manager for Southern Nevada. And then we are also the implementer of the bike share program in Southern Nevada. So when you think of that, that's a lot, right? A lot of hats. Only agents in the U.S. to wear all those hats, have all those functions under one roof. And if you look at the way we were created, it was actually done through the state legislature. We were formed back in '65. For 16 years, we were the Streets and Highway Commission. And then in 1981, because of our regional structure, we became the Southern Nevada's Metropolitan Planning Organization. In 1983, the state legislature said, hey, RTC, you're going to be now the public transit provider. After a failed ballot question in '92, that actually came to fruition. We started operating public transit here. In 2004, we incorporated traffic management under our umbrella. And then in 2016, we launched a bike share system in downtown Las Vegas. And I tell you all that because, again, our forefathers, thank you, they went big. And if not for this regional approach, for example, in the early 80s when we were given the authority to operate as a public transit system, it did not allow for the cities or the county to operate their own transit systems. It had to be regional, and that is because of how our governance structure started. And I think because of that, collaboration is really part of our DNA. We work closely with all of the cities in the county. It enables us to plan and implement projects, I think, more efficiently and more effectively because, again, we wear all those hats. We're able to really, particularly around multimodal projects that involve road construction, bus lanes, traffic signals, protected bike lanes, and pedestrian amenities. And you won't find this type of structure in other cities. So, for example, when someone crosses a city boundary, they may experience a different entity that is managing traffic or the bus system, for example, and that could be very nuanced differences or something that's very obvious. And we know that our residents lead regional lives, and it should be seamless. It shouldn't matter what city or county that you're residing there or traveling to. So I have to say that our forefathers, whether they stumbled upon this governance structure, they did it right. And so from a regional approach, it works really well for us here at the RTC.
Thanks, MJ. That's really interesting, and one of the many reasons why we wanted to have you on, because it is a different perspective, and it's not very common in the U.S. And so with that, I want to turn it over to you, Leslie, and talk about your role in the Philadelphia region and how SEPTA fits into that transportation puzzle.
Right. Well, again, thanks for having me here. Great to be here with you, Paul, and MJ and Kevin, of course. It's true what MJ said. We always say you've seen one transit agency, you've seen one transit agency. I think it's going to be true here. So we are, governed very differently. We are regional, which is great. We cover 5 counties, Philadelphia being the most densely populated county with a population of 1.5. And then when you take 1.5 million, and then when you take the other 4 counties into consideration, we reach 6 million residents of all of those counties. Our board is a 15-member board, and it is appointed equally with 2 members of each county. So Philadelphia does not have a majority. They have 2 votes in a 15-member board, with 10 of those votes being county votes, and then 5 coming from the state, from the Senate and from the House, and 1 from the governor. So really no one has the majority, which makes it all the more interesting. What is interesting here is our MPO covers all 5 counties. It covers more than that, by the way, but it does cover all 5 of our counties. So it's nice that we have one MPO to work with, and that's the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Organization. I had the honor of chairing their board for some time, and so knowing how they work as a region has been very helpful. Then PennDOT also is divided into districts, and one of their districts, their District 6, is the exact 5-county area that SEPTA also serves. So even though there's different organizations working together, it's nice that they each have divisions of them that cover the same grouping of 5 counties. So that's helpful. And we are known as a state agency, which makes it a little more difficult as far as our funding, right? Where the funding comes from. So our funding, 50% of our operating funds come from the state. And so we have to convince, 253 legislators that they should be investing in a transit agency in Southeastern Pennsylvania, where the majority of them, frankly, don't care about Philadelphia and the surrounding regions or will ever come here. So that's a little bit challenging. Just to give us, I just wanted to paint in general without getting into the weeds of where we are. Of course, we work with the city, we work with all the county governments, all the different elected officials. I think what has been challenging is our funding streams, convincing a larger body, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, what our needs are here and how it goes back into the Commonwealth. But what we're getting right is we're talking to the state, and we asked to get borrowing capacity with that money. Initially, that money was coming from a borrowed stream, and now it's coming from a stream where we can borrow on it. So for the very first time, we just introduced the largest capital budget ever here at SEPTA, which is $1.162 billion, which is fantastic. But I do want to remind everybody else who's aware of what legacy systems usually have. So like the Chicagos, the Bostons, the DCs, they have well over $2 billion. And so we're still, at a fraction of what they're at, but we're getting closer. And so that feels really good. And then another example of what's working right is at the MPO level, our CMAQ money, where the congestion mitigation air quality money comes to each county. We told them about an expansion project here that would help all of the counties, that would connect all of those residents to the third largest employment center here, which happens to be in Montgomery County, King of Prussia. They all agreed, and they pulled their CMAQ money together, all 5 counties, so that we could use it for local match when we compete for federal grants for that. So we do work well in a county, even though there's all these other things going on. And the last thing I'll say before passing it off is the reason I mentioned PennDOT and the city and SEPTA is because everyone has different, I think MJ sounds so nice that it's all put together. So we have some roads, even I'm looking at my window right now. So one road I can look at, PennDOT paves that road and PennDOT maintains that road. And then another road I can see the city owns that road and the city, and it doesn't always make sense, and it doesn't. And then the signals, right? And then as you go out to the counties, each municipality has their own. So whenever we do any type of signal prioritization, which we're trying to do right now, and then the bus shelters as well are owned by the municipalities and by the city, and we have to work with them. So just to tell you some of the complexity of the relationships here.
That's great. Talking about board structure, funding, jurisdiction. That's really getting right into it. So we've got a lot of follow-up questions on those things. But first, let's turn it over to Kevin. Kevin, you've worked in the U.S. and now in Canada and experienced a lot of different governance structures. And I think the one in Vancouver is an interesting one. And before we had this webinar, we're talking offline, and a lot of good things to say about what's happened in Vancouver, of course. But you know it more than anyone. So just give us some of the perspectives on what's working well in Vancouver and how it works to kick us off.
Sure. Thanks, Paul. And really good to be here with MJ and Leslie. Good to see you both. I'll kind of start off just by talking about TransLink for a second. And I promise it'll kind of loop back to sort of answering your question. So, TransLink oversees is the transportation authority for Metro Vancouver, overseeing transit in the Metro Vancouver region, which is about 2.5 million people. And so with 2.5 million people, pre-COVID, we were doing 450 million trips per year. So, there's a really high, we pack our punch, right? It's a really kind of high per capita ridership, but we've got roughly over 200 bus routes, 50 miles of SkyTrain, C-Bus. So there's a ferry. Really excited to have sort of managing ferries. The West Coast Express, which is the commuter rail system up here, as well as accessible transit and paratransit services, as well as transit police. Similar to MJ and Las Vegas, which I will also just note maybe the first time anyone has ever compared and said that Las Vegas and Vancouver were similar. But anyways, TransLink has kind of a wide mandate. So it's not just these transit pieces, but TransLink also oversees the major road network. So we work with municipalities within the region to really plan and maintain what's called the MRN, or major road network, which, in American context is essentially major arterial roads kind of throughout the region, which carry commuter transit and truck traffic. And so we contribute funding for kind of operations and maintenance of the MRN, but the ownership really still resides with local municipalities. We also fund a variety of road, cycling, pedestrian improvements. And we also own and maintain 5 pretty significant bridges within the region. We also oversee the regional goods movement strategy. So what this means is essentially we do a lot of coordination with the freight movement, the trucking community, to really streamline and improve freight movement throughout the region. And then lastly, we're big in that kind of active transportation space of the cycling programs, allocating funding for that, bike lockers, bike parkades, things like that. So now the governance, right? So that kind of is the snapshot of what TransLink looks like. And so the governance is really quite complex up here. So there's really 2 bodies. There's a board of directors and a mayor's council. And so the board of directors is 11 members. 2 of them are from the mayor's council that I'll talk a bit in a second. And 2 are appointed from the province. So it's an 11-member board of directors that I think, you could really think of as more of kind of a corporate type of a board, overseeing policy, overseeing, kind of day-to-day operations, things like that, supervising kind of the management, the annual operating budget, annual reports. It's kind of a corporate board, but a very non-political board. And then separately, you have the Mayor's Council, which is composed of 21 mayors in Metro Vancouver, the chief of one of the First Nations in the Metro Vancouver region, as well as an elected representative of another area. So you could think of it as essentially 23 mayors in a way that then oversee kind of the long-term strategies and investments, revenue generation, those long-term strategies, our 30-year plan, our 10-year investment plan. They oversee things like fair. Can you all still hear me?
Okay, now.
Oh yeah, we lost you there for a second, but you're back.
Oh, he's frozen again.
Uh-oh. Little technical difficulties on Kevin's end. We're going to let that reset a little bit on his side and continue the conversation, because and Kevin, we'll let you pick up here in just a moment when he rejoins. But MJ, you had some. Oh, there, he's back.
Yay.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there. The page kind of spazzed out on me.
All right.
So
well, you're back. You're into it. So please continue.
Yeah. So, just to give kind of some perspective. So, I spent the last, prior to coming to Vancouver, I spent 4 years managing the Maryland Transit Administration in Baltimore, which is a very unique model as well, right? So that's a model where the governor, really oversees the Maryland Transit Administration. It reports up to the executive branch of state government. And so this is one end of the spectrum, right, where decisions are kind of made by one person, and there are pros and cons to that. And then I feel like I've gone to kind of this other end of the spectrum, right, of an 11-member board, 23 mayors, right? It's suddenly very complex. And so I usually get a lot of sympathy around that, but I want to convey that I think there are some real benefits. I think there's a place for kind of a non-political board of directors that provides this sort of oversight and guidance and kind of fiduciary responsibility. I think that's important to have. I would also argue that there's a place for a political body that is responsible for taxation of constituents, that's in touch with kind of what's politically palatable at a given time. And so I think what the model gets right, to answer your question, Paul, is real stability around sort of a diffused power model. And what this means is that anything that has to get accomplished through consensus. And this kind of creates this long-term stability that I think the Vancouver region is really well known for. The last piece that I'll note that I touched on at the beginning is kind of the diversification of TransLink's mandate. And by diversifying of the freight community, the cycling community, the transit community, we essentially create kind of a bigger tent, right? And so that helps to generate kind of these consensus-based decisions that I think can really last, pass through election cycles that we know can be very impactful. And so TransLink then sits in a very powerful position to mobilize those voices really around regional priorities. And kind of conversely, with this model, you don't end up with, say, a single mayor or a single advocacy group that has the ability to kind of yell the loudest or kind of stomp their feet, right? And so I think what TransLink has gotten right is sort of this regional view, having a non-political board, having a political body that brings that kind of long-term stability, again, to a region that's really kind of known for that.
Great. Thanks for finishing that thought. Just quick question, Kevin. Does TransLink have control over the broadband network?
No. No.
So it wasn't your fault, right?
No.
Yeah. All right. So I want to loop back to some of the comments that you had, MJ, talking about how the forefathers in the region had some good insights, and you appreciated some of the authorities that your organization has. Given that you have a very consolidated governance model, what challenges does that bring in implementing some of these transportation solutions? Perhaps it's related to the fact that you have to wear many hats, but I'd like to hear some of your thoughts about the challenges.
Sure. I do want to say, Kevin, I was listening to you. I was feeling sympathy, and I was thinking, give that man a raise. But he's got an amazing structure up there. That I know. I'm almost a little jealous. You know, one of the biggest challenges here in Las Vegas is how our community came to be. We are our land use. We are sprawled, and if you've been here, I think you see that, and it's created a very car-centric community. So our transit system is very young, particularly compared to my peers here. It has a lot of potential. It has a lot of opportunity, but like every transit agency, funding is a problem. We don't receive funding from the state, and so funding for mobility services, including innovative projects, has always been and continues to be a challenge. And believe it or not, our governance structure in this case has not been helpful. And let me explain that. So in other communities, the MPO and the transit agency are two separate organizations with two distinct board of directors. Because we are both the transit agency and the MPO with one board of commissioners, seeking additional funding from our MPO for transit projects or even innovative projects. You know, I want to introduce microtrans on demand. Funding is an issue. Let's go to the MPO and ask for funding. There was a perception from the counties and the city that we were sort of double dipping. You know, the fact that we had the ability to walk down the hallway, the transit folks, and say to the MPO folks, hey, you know, we'd like to get into your funding queue. And I think, so we've never done that. And I think that somehow the cities and the county really looked at that as that funding belonged rightfully to them. And I really don't blame them for thinking that way, because we had not done a very good job in clarifying our governance structure. So, you know, I'm happy to report a couple of years ago, I sat down with our board of commissioners, had a very thoughtful conversation, let them know how unique our organization is, spent time with the cities and the county to also explain the same thing. And as soon as we run through our stimulus funding, we will have an opportunity to get into that annual queue with the MPO and apply for whether it's STP or CMAQ, or even there's some local sales tax in that streets and highways program. So again, it's the governance is awesome. It's regional, but we never took advantage of that structure. And I think even if funding is available, like most transit agencies, we do not own the right of way. And so convincing the cities and the county to give up a lane for traffic, you know, insert car-centric Southern Nevada here, especially for a bus or bike project, it can be extremely challenging, regardless of our governance structure. I will note that the state of Nevada is very tech-friendly. I think it's almost expected by the cities and the county that we will look for innovative mobility solutions. But it's really more of a balance on how to, you know, what do you do with the existing roadway capacity among all modes, and who gets preference, particularly because we, for so long, have given preference to the car. And I'm seeing that starting to change, but I think for us, that's been kind of the challenge, that we are all under one roof, and just asking the MPO, our MPO, for funding for transit. It was, hey, why are you doing that, RTC? That, you know, that's not your funding. So again, it's about education, and it's about being collaborative with local jurisdictions. And so we'll be there. We'll be asking for funding. If anyone's on the call listening, we'll be there.
Love it. Funding comes up an awful lot, and funding and governance is inextricably linked, right? That's something that anyone that goes into governance and you're trying to figure out who's on the board and why, you just follow the funding. That's usually a good way to do it. And Leslie, I want to turn to you a little bit. The system in the Philadelphia region is very different than that in Las Vegas, right? Where there's lots of different organizations. You have a board that you talked about that has a lot of folks that aren't even in the region. And so maybe you can just give a little perspective on how you overcome some of those challenges. What are some of your strategies for working with other organizations to advance your mission as an organization?
Sure, it's a big challenge. I mentioned, first of all, Kevin did such a great job in talking about the system. I just want to make sure everyone understands. So we are a legacy system. We're the 6th largest transit agency in the United States, and we have a variety of modes. So we have subways, we have buses, we have trolleys, we have trackless trolleys, and we also have regional rail service. So just it's many modes. It's an old system that has been put together from buying a lot of systems. So even though we have 2 main subway lines, I just don't want people to think, oh, well, that's easy. It's not easy because they were started by 2 different companies. They have 2 different track widths. They have different types of, they were built differently. We can't run the same subway cars even on either one. So just want to let everyone know the challenges that we have. With 50% of our operating budget coming from the state, it has been very tricky in trying to let people in the Commonwealth who will never come to Southeastern Pennsylvania know why it is so important that they fund the 6th largest transit agency. Philadelphia and the region is very densely populated. The city doesn't function without high-performing transit. Employers here, which are some of the largest in the Commonwealth, are located here. Obviously, our sales and income tax go to Harrisburg, which is our capital, and then get redistributed. Philly sends a lot more than what we get back. There are 67 counties here, so we always make that point as well. I don't think I mentioned, before this job, I also was the secretary of the Department of Transportation, so very familiar with PennDOT, where I was in that position for 5 years and dealing with the state legislators. And so what we do when we talk with the state legislators, obviously we get our board members, particularly the chairman of our board, who is a well-known Republican, myself, who was appointed by a Democratic governor. So we team up always, maybe with other board members as well. Because transit is transportation. Transportation is definitely a bipartisan issue. And what we do, as in being one of the largest employers in the Commonwealth, is we always go with a map and we show all 67 counties in the Commonwealth and where we get our services, our equipment, our technology, where we get our steels, our nuts and our bolts, and the products that we need to run this very large system. We do business with the majority of counties. And one of the maps I usually show is over the last 5 years how we've spent over $1.5 billion in Pennsylvania firms. Obviously we always talk about jobs. We talk about how we connect the largest employment centers of the Commonwealth and how we provide opportunities for everybody. How when we cut down on congestion here in Southeastern Pennsylvania, how that helps reduce or keep product level prices at a certain point. Congestion adds money to everything. It's not just time wasted, but when things can't get delivered in a timely fashion as well, it makes prices of all of our goods go up. So we talk about all of those things. And obviously, if anything would impact the economy of Southeastern Pennsylvania, it impacts the economy of the Commonwealth because of all the money that goes back to Harrisburg. So we're always making those connections. The one other thing that we work on that I just want to highlight as well is people are always frustrated that we're not only focused on Philadelphia every minute of every day. We are a regional agency. We do have bus routes that go out to our regional counties. And we have Philadelphia residents who have jobs outside of the city as well. And so we are constantly showing everyone where our investments are, why investments are important, and why connecting people inside the city as well as outside the city, making that easier, by the way, and making sure that we do it in the most affordable and equitable way. Obviously, servicing our most disadvantaged neighborhoods is very important to us as well. But that whole city suburb issue always comes up. And, we're always talking about it. And Paul, you said it, the funding follows the decision makers, follows the appointed members of the board, and just reminding everybody when they're angry or when they're angry at the board members, it's common. We just had an article come up that our board doesn't look like the demographics of our ridership. And you can't, I'm always talking about, you can't blame our board members, because when the governor asks you to serve on a board, you're not going to say no. When a county commissioner asks you to serve, when a mayor asks you to serve, you want to do your best, and they know your background, and maybe you're put on because you're good with finances, or you're good with social services, or you're good with business, or you're good with customer experience. And our board members have all different talents. So just to remind the public of how everything works, and if they want to make change, it starts on who they elect, and then who appoints the board. It's all those different steps. So just reminding everybody how that process happens and where you can be influential or make impacts.
Very well said. No, and we hear that in a lot of different places around the country, and we want to get into that a little bit here in a few minutes. But I want to turn it over to Kevin, picking up on this same thing. I'm following some of the questions coming in, and a couple are coming in about doing projects that cross jurisdictional boundaries, right? Things that are not necessarily in your purview as an agency, whether that's doing bus lanes on roads that are not yours, or implementing some kind of roadway pricing, or there's a couple questions that have come in about bike share and whether bike share falls under your specific organizational purview, and if not, how do you coordinate with a service that's quite complementary? So kind of building on some of these challenge questions that MJ and Leslie just talked about, I'd like to hear some of how that happens in Vancouver.
Sure, absolutely. So I think, again, similar to the concerns of that MJ noted, we struggle too with kind of this street right-of-way management ownership, like most transit agencies, transportation authorities. TransLink doesn't own the street, the municipalities do. And so I think it's especially acute in Metro Vancouver. Back in Baltimore, is like you just dealt with Baltimore City, and now there's 23 municipalities that each have their own different rules and regulations that you have to work with, and many cross those jurisdictional boundaries, right? So rolling things out like bus priority infrastructure can be challenging. And I will say that it's especially timely. About a month ago, we just released our 10-year priorities document, kind of our vision for the future of the next 10 years in Metro Vancouver, and it essentially envisions rolling out 170 kilometers of up to 9 new BRT routes in the next 10 years. And so we all know what it takes to deliver a successful BRT project, right? It's dedicated right of way, it's signal priority. So we're really focused on how to work with municipalities and communities to really deliver those investments. How to do it, to get to your question, Paul, I think. So part of it is about, building that consensus around both problem and solution, right? So, in Metro Vancouver, the problem that is so strongly felt is affordability. Metro Vancouver is right there with the likes of, San Francisco in terms of housing affordability. And here as well, we're seeing the effects of climate change really happen now. And so with housing costs out of control, there's kind of joint consensus and recognition around these problems, and that we've got to do something about them. So I think, transportation's in this unique position to solve kind of multiple problems for communities. And the key is really gaining consensus around those solutions, which we know can take lots of different forms, require different revenue streams, require different amounts of revenue. But so to kind of enact those investments, or to get policymakers to kind of consider the hard decisions around some of those solutions. It's kind of this combination of what's politically affordable against the positive impact that it's going to have on the region. And so, as we've seen with this recent 10-year priority, it's about ensuring, that we're proposing projects that meet these regional needs as well as meet the needs of the local municipalities, as well as are realistically, somewhat affordable. We've got to be able to fund these things. And so it's really great to say that these boards or these bodies, wear solely regional hats. But I think the truth is we know that transportation is just inherently kind of political. And we're kind of kidding ourselves if we try to pretend otherwise, right? Transportation is political. And so we've got to meet the needs of those individual municipalities while also selling kind of a regional vision.
That's really well said. MJ, I want to go to you. You have a different structure, right, than most places because you are so consolidated. When you're doing things like bike lanes or bike share or bus lanes or working with the freight network, right? How is it different in Las Vegas than it is in other regions? And what challenges do you still have in those kind of things that are maybe outside of the traditional remit of a transit agency or a state DOT?
So I think it's a couple of things that you need when you're talking about multimodal cross-jurisdictional projects. I think having a defined process in place helps. And what I mean by that is, as the regional roadway funding agency, we work almost daily with the cities and the county, with their local planning and public works staff, with their traffic planners. It's really constant communication. At the RTC alone, we have 6 standing committees that help facilitate conversation and dialogue surrounding short and long-term projects, transportation projects. So there's a chance to sort of talk through who's doing what, who needs funding, what are priorities. And again, it isn't just, let's think about a project, hey, who should I call? It is, again, this defined process where there's an opportunity for the agenda to be set and these conversations to take place in our role in terms of how the funding is going to be allocated. For Las Vegas, I'll give you a recent example of that sort of multi-jurisdictional cross collaboration. There is a stretch of roadway here in Southern Nevada called Boulder Highway. It was established back in the 1930s as a way for the dam workers to get to Hooper Dam. So really the only highway system at that time. Since then, it has changed dramatically. Even though it was a highway once, there's a lot of development around it, commercial development, residential development, a lot of mixed use, a lot of multiple family homes. And it really borders a very transit dependent community. It's also one of the deadliest stretches of roadway in our state. 10% of pedestrian fatalities are on this 15-mile stretch. So I think the second thing that you need to have, if you're going to get collaboration regionally, I think you have to find a shared priority. And so this corridor, it crosses through, NDOT actually owns the right of way. It crosses through a county and 2 cities, but every single stakeholder is concerned about safety and improving safety. And they're willing to look at investments along that corridor with support from elected officials at the state and local level. We get the safety community involved. We get the community at large involved. It really was about sitting down with this county, the cities, and NDOT to say, how can we let's look at a plan, and that plan is underway right now. It's called Reimagine Boulder Highway, and that this 50-mile stretch is about widened sidewalks, additional sidewalks, enhanced lighting, protected bike lanes, and potentially a center running bus rapid transit project. But here's the challenge. While each jurisdiction is absolutely concerned about safety and making safety improvements, each jurisdiction gets to decide when they're going to fund the project, right? So even though we're the funding agency, we do not tell the jurisdictions when to fund a project. It's really up to them. So you can have this. So as an example, the city of Henderson, they applied for an infra grant. They were successful. So they're already starting they've gone through the NEPA process. They're starting the design on that. The 2 other, the city and the county that, they're looking at competing interests in terms of funding. And so do they make investments now along with the city in this corridor? It certainly is a priority, but they also have competing interests within their own jurisdictional boundaries. So in our role as the regional funding agency, and the fact that we are the federal grant recipient, we're going to work very closely with them to apply through funding through the IIJA, particularly the hopefully the mega grant applications, so that we can at least start doing some of the heavy lifting, going after the grant funding to dive right into NEPA and the design piece. So I think it's important, again, there's a process in place, there's a shared priority, but we always come back to funding. And it depends. One city may have that, maybe the top of their list in terms of this corridor that crosses multiple jurisdictions. So we'll get some of it done, but you're going to see if you're leaving a Roundville or highway, you're going to have a center running BRT going through the city of Henderson, and it's going to stop, and you're not going to see that progress in the other jurisdictions because they are, again, they have competing interests. So in the end, we know where our boundaries are. We provide the funding, the recommendations to local jurisdictions. Sometimes we're the project manager. I think we're looking to assist there, but it's really the local jurisdictions that are going to make the final decisions.
That's great. There's some really, really good examples in there. So I appreciate you sharing that. I'm going through, there's a ton of really, really good questions that are coming in. And I've got one that I think would be good for you, Leslie. Talking about, you were talking about challenges in building consensus, right? Not just within your board, but within the region, challenges with funding, and yet a lot of pressure from a regional standpoint to meet some of these big goals that we have, climate change being one of them, safety, you name it. Can you talk about some of the things that you're doing to address some of those big goals and how you're balancing that with challenges with consensus, challenges with funding?
Yeah, so we have advocacy groups that we reach out to on a local level. We're working on one of the things that, because of the pandemic, I think we are all dealing with, I would say, huge societal problems that are impacting our system. For us, it's the challenges from the vulnerable population, those experiencing homelessness, drug addiction, mental health challenges. And it's been exacerbated during the pandemic. And so in reaching out to others and working on larger issues such as climate change as well, I've put that in there, equity, what we saw, what has always been there, but obviously the focus on, systemic racial equity that was definitely talked about in a different way after George Floyd's murder than it had been talked about before, and addressing those issues. And just for those who may not know, so Philadelphia is the largest, poorest city in the state as well. So that racial equity gap is also huge, right? And trying to bring people out of poverty at the same time. And so, all of those things, we want to do our part. We know that we can't do it alone, right? A transit agency can't solve climate change, can't solve, people dealing with drug addiction, can't solve equity by ourselves. But we can definitely be part of the solution. I feel like we're the part of every solution. And so we're always, talking about it, working with others, working on the local level, whether it's a local nonprofit or organization. I've learned a ton about social services that I didn't know before. And, if you don't have housing, you no matter how compassionately you're talking to those who are using our system as shelter because they either have nowhere else to go or they have other challenges that they're dealing with, you can only help so far, so much. I would say everything we do is related to climate change because every car that we get off the road is helping with, I don't mean to bounce it around with all these huge societal issues, but there's a common theme in that these very huge problems that are much bigger than ours, right, that we can partner with others and find others that have similar priorities, right, to work on. So every time we get a car off the road, we're reducing greenhouse gases. Our system is extremely clean in that subways, trolleys, and regional rail are already electrified. So they're already using clean energy. And we're slowly turning our fleet into zero emission fleet as well, just like all the transit agencies throughout the country are planning on doing. And so we'll continue to do that as well. And then just talking about how that helps everybody. And here in the Philadelphia region, it's easy to talk about that as we give people opportunities, as we try to do everything we can to give people a more equitable future, to give people, better ways of providing for themselves and for their families. You want to do that in a livable city, in a livable community where people feel safe, where they feel connected, where there's good environmental stewardship. So like everything I've talked about is what you want to see in a livable community. And that's what we want to be here. And you only get to be, a world-class livable city if you have a high-quality transit system. So that's how we tie it all together and get people on the common themes. I always say that our success is your success, whether I'm talking to the city, whether I'm talking to the counties, whether I'm talking to advocates for climate change, whether I'm talking to advocates on homelessness, or whether I'm talking with others who are working to reduce poverty levels. We all want to succeed, and we all succeed together.
That's great. A lot of really good points there. The one thing that I think resonated with me a little bit is your discussion about advocacy, right? And the role that advocacy groups can play. It was something that came up a lot on a webinar we had a week and a half ago, where we were talking about transit strategies to meet climate change goals, and advocacy came up an awful lot. So I just thought that I heard that a few times, and I thought that was important just to highlight. I want to
something also, not to belabor the point. It's something that doesn't always work well unless you focus on it and you work on it. I'm very pleased right now where we are with our advocacy groups, and trust me, they challenge us when they see that or don't feel that we're doing all that we can do, and it's good to have that back and forth. But it's good to be talking all the time with them.
That's great. I want to shift gears a little bit, just being mindful of about 12 minutes left here before the top of the hour. There's a bunch of questions that are coming up about board composition. It's a few of you have mentioned that. I think it's really important and probably underappreciated, but particularly, and this one's for you, Kevin, talking about the difference between a board that's made up of elected officials, either some kind of appointed but coming from some jurisdiction where they're part of your board, and then non-governmental officials, which you have on your board in Vancouver. Can you talk a little bit, Kevin, about the difference in those two approaches and maybe some pluses and minuses that you've experienced in your career?
Well, sure. So, the board of directors, as it exists for TransLink, has essentially 7 kind of independent, kind of professional members, not really affiliated. You've got 2 that are appointed by the province, and so the provincial role is a real interesting one that I've gotten to know in Canada. In the U.S., there's a lot of focus on federal government. There's a lot of funding that really flows from the feds. In Canada, some of the money comes from the feds, but it all really flows to the province. And so you've really got to coordinate. That's, a very important body. So you've got a couple of members with the province and then a couple from the mayor's council. So for our board of directors, it's the chair and vice chair of the mayor's council that actually sit on the board of directors. So what that results in is generally sort of non-political discussions, given that the majority of the 11 are not really politically affiliated. And so I think that what that allows is that body to really dig into, policy and the day-to-day operations and the governance of the organization without diving into kind of the pet projects of a specific municipality. That conversation can happen over with a mayor's council that's looking more regionally and more long-term and is more focused on those types of things. And so, I want to be clear, though, that doesn't mean that the lines are perfectly drawn. Right. There are plenty of gray areas where there is conflict and that there's always work to be done. I think any of us sitting here aren't going to say that our structures are perfect. Right. There's always room for improvement. And so I think, the lines are drawn well between this board and this mayor's council, but there is plenty of gray that causes conflict that, as sort of the CEO and staff, we have to work through every time there's kind of those little gray areas of conflict.
That's great, and appreciate that. I want to pick up on in the last 10 minutes here. You said there's always room for improvement, And one of the title of this webinar, of course, is Reforming Governance, because that's one of the topics we wanted to get into. I think that there's often reform ideas in every region. People have ideas on how to tweak or overhaul or totally blow up and start over the governance. And so there's a lot of good ideas. The question, though, of course, is how do you do it? How do you start to change governance, even if it's relatively small changing of the board composition or funding streams, or I mean, those are not necessarily small, but right, those things. How do we go about doing that, right? And MJ, you talked about some of the history of RTC and how RTC kind of absorbed some of these responsibilities over time. Whereas in other cases, governance can kind of happen as a single explosion event where there's just a big change. Talk about, I'm going to go to, we're going to talk about reform, MJ and Leslie and Kevin in that order. Just give me your thoughts about what might be some changes you want to see and how would you go about that in a region?
Well, I think you have to be realistic. I mean, there's reform done at the state level through the legislative process. And certainly that is collaborative. It depends on who is serving, if it's the R's or the D's, who has control over the decision making at that level. But when you do it at the state level through statute or through the Constitution, that's something that's set in stone. You can reform policy within your local cities by way of a mayor or council that can be overturned after that mayor or council, has termed out or is not reelected. And so I think we're really thoughtful about if making reform. An example that we knew we needed to make a change at the state level. We were going to go out for a ballot question. Well, I do want to say too, reforming governance. Again, I believe there's got to be a shared priority if you're going to get that buy-in. When I think of Los Angeles, for example, the one mayor who was so instrumental in pushing forward a ballot question on behalf of Measure M. Here in Southern Nevada, we have multiple mayors. And so it may not be that every mayor on behalf of their jurisdiction is concerned about the same issue. But in 2016, as the roadway funding agency, we knew we were going to run out of money. We wanted to go to a ballot question. The only way to do that, we had to go to the state legislature and change our statute to allow the locals and the counties to tax themselves, to index fuel tax to inflation. We couldn't do that at the local level because that would have been sort of this boomerang kind of effect that it's in place and it's not in place, it's in place. So we did that at the statutory level where we were given the authority to go to the ballot question. It was very successful. And it was successful not only because it was done in kind of a permanent way, it was successful because, and again, in this car-centric community of ours, funding for roadways was sort of this, let's go. We need money for cars. We need money for more roadways. And it was kind of easy to get around, but it's in place. It allows us to index fuel tax to inflation for the next 10 years. What happens in 10 years? Again, well, what happens to, it's going to look a little different because even though statutorily, we can index fuel tax inflation, we may have to start over when this indexing piece expires, and you can sort of start that process again. How do we ensure that we have this new policy in place? Is it done again at the state level? Is it done through an election? Is it done through a local body? But I think we've had success here in Southern Nevada when change is effectuated on behalf of again among local jurisdictions, a shared priority.
Great, and some really good examples. Thanks for that, MJ. Leslie, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's something that comes up, but then nobody wants to get involved. It is a long, process. You'd have to go through state legislation and enabling legislation, and so it's hard to say how it would begin and how it would end up, because even now, one of the issues that we're talking about is whether or not our local counties, and Philadelphia is a county and a city at the same time with the same borders, how they could raise local funds and put it to local uses. They cannot do so right now without state enabling legislation. So thinking, I'm just giving this as an example to show the complexity of making change. On some levels, a lot of people think that's a no-brainer, right? That Philadelphia should be able to raise their own money, Montgomery County, Bucks County, Delaware County, Chester County, and then put it toward their own transportation needs. It seems pretty simple, but legislators at the state are very reluctant to give away any type of authority that they already have. Right now, they have the authority to say where the money goes and how it is spent. And even though it may not be their highest priority or have zero impact on their own constituencies, they're reluctant to give away authority that they currently have. And I think that's a very common thing we would see with elected officials, right? There aren't a lot who run on the fact that they want to give away any type of influence that they have. So it just gets to a point where it is quite difficult. And then when things were put together, sometimes they're put together so that you govern better. Like I always think of, sunshine laws that we have here in Pennsylvania, or think, as we deal with civil service agreements, like when I was at the Commonwealth and working for the DOT, we wanted to diversify our workforce. Well, it's very hard to diversify your workforce when you have to follow civil service rules that say you have to give preference, and we're more than happy to, by the way, give preference to veterans. Veterans who have experience on the large part that we see in the middle of Pennsylvania are largely white and male. And while they are very good employees, it's very hard to diversify when you're restricted, right, in certain areas that lead to a homogeneous demographic. And so no one is going to run on, I'm going to take, preferences away from veterans. That's not going to be a winning. You're not going to get, most likely you're not going to get to govern, because you're not going to get into your office if that's what you're running on. Or if you're running on, I'm going to take, influence away from different things. So it just gets quite complicated. It's not that it can't be done. It is difficult. And one other thing I'll just add is when Kevin was talking about, the challenges when you have all the different board members, political versus not political and appointed. I just want to give the example that was very difficult was dealing with COVID. Not having the governor have a heavy hand with us or the mayor, we were on our own. So to get tests, to get vaccines, to get all of the things that I saw transit agencies that had heavy support in those areas. And trust me, there are pros and cons to everything. It can be difficult to weigh on those. So those are just a few examples.
Thanks for that. Kevin, I will end with you, I guess, here. I was just looking at the time, talking
Sure.
about governance reform. There was a quasi-recent governance reform that happened in the Vancouver region. Maybe talk a little bit about that and how that happened.
Yeah, so TransLink is set up by way of the let's see if I can get it right, the South Coast British Columbia Transportation Authority Act. I've been working on memorizing that, and there's been governance changes over the last 20 years. Really, the biggest one that happened most recently was in 2008, 2007 to kind of the current model, where it went from just sort of driven by mayors to having a board and kind of a mayor's. And there's been kind of tweaks here and there, but it's kind of around that. I want to, and maybe I can kind of take a step back if I can, Paul, just to kind of close us out maybe a little bit, just with some kind of thoughts I've had, as I've transitioned from the US to Canada in this. I think in order to reform governance, and we're talking about this here in Vancouver as well, I think a couple of things. One, there's got to be a real clear reason for change, right? Did something happen that wasn't good policy? Because if things kind of seem good, there's not going to be this kind of broad consensus for change. And secondly, I think you've really got to make the case, right? Essentially, what's the return on investment for the proposed reforms? Is it new revenue streams? Is it streamlined decision making? Does it enable more kind of effective rollout of transportation projects? Because senior policymakers are going to expend political capital for whatever the change is, and they're going to want to know what the ROI is. And so they want to be sure that it's worth it, right? I think just to respond to some of the comments as well earlier, there's always a lot of focus, and maybe this kind of zooms out from the good examples that MJ and Leslie were given. But a lot of people focus on kind of this question of who governs, right? And there's a lot of focus on funding changes as a result of the answer to that question. So kind of who governs and who pays for it. So, how will the funding change if we change the governance? And those are really important questions. I was in a governance conversation yesterday, and that's constantly something that's been discussed here in Vancouver. We're always talking about governance. And so I would suggest, kind of based on my experience in Vancouver and in Maryland, that a couple additional questions to really start from that are broader is one, what to govern, right? What is the scope of governance? Kind of, getting to some of what I was talking about earlier, how big is the tent? What's the overall scope of the transportation authority? Should it be bigger or smaller, more diverse? Because I think the answer to this question has a larger impact on success than we kind of give it credit for. So I think there's a lot there. And I think the second piece is kind of is how to govern. What's the best way for decisions to be made? What's the most effective way to create long-term stability and regional thinking? And how do we create a system that allows us to tackle kind of those thorniest challenges? So, answering those two questions, kind of what to govern and how to govern, I think are really good starting points that maybe we don't spend enough time on thinking about. Just some reflections.
That's very, very, very good reflection. I'm seeing some good reactions from the audience. MJ, Leslie, any final thoughts just to before we close? Just want to make sure we're not give you an opportunity to final reactions before we close up.
No, I think, gosh, Leslie and Kevin really hit on, again, one government is not the same. I think you have to have a collaboration, even if you do have, you work with multiple cities. It's that collaboration, it's that shared vision, it's that shared priorities, and it's understanding whether you need to make a change of statutorily or you need to make a change at your local level. It takes a lot of work, a lot of communication, a lot of collaboration.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add, and again, really enjoyed being part of this conversation with everybody, is I love that SEPTA is regional. People often say, well, don't you wish you just had to deal, with Philadelphia, which is quite large and trust me, would be challenging in its own right. But I think that we're able to do a lot more and impact those large societal challenges that we all have because we are regional. And so I would not trade that in. I don't want that to come across. I don't think it did, but I think it's wonderful when you can have that regional impact. That's
great. I very much agree. And really want to appreciate your time. I know you all are very busy, have a lot going on. This has been a really productive conversation. Lots of great questions. And again, thank you for taking the time. And we hope to continue this conversation in the future. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you all.